On this channel, we cover more than our fair share of dumb crimes and criminals. This video is a little different though. Today we're going to be looking at two cases where criminals might actually have gotten away with it if it weren't for a small accident or a bit of bad luck. Just a heads up, this is actually a re-release of a video we did a couple of years back. If you didn't see our announcement a little while ago, the next few weeks are going to be a little bit weird for us upload-wise. You can check out a link to the full explanation in the description below, but long story short, we're working to get back on track. While that's happening, we're digging into the Crime Zone vault to make sure we can continue to bring you all something in the meantime. With that out of the way, let's get into it. On August 7th, 2017, a delivery driver pulled up to the main security area of the Darrell B. Hester Juvenile Correction Center in the city of San Benito, Texas. The driver spoke to a guard working there, saying that he was with the Labatt Food Service Company and was headed for the loading dock to drop off that day's order. The security guard was confused. As far as he knew, the facility hadn't been expecting a food delivery that day. He was even more baffled when he learned what the supposed food order was comprised of. It was nothing but fajita meat. 800 pounds of the stuff, to be specific. For starters, the Juvenile Correction Center was a small facility. Less than 100 detainees were kept there at any given time, so 800 pounds of anything would have been out of the norm, let alone 800 pounds of fajitas, which the facility never even served on its menu. Believing that the whole thing was some sort of mix-up, the security guard told the driver that he probably had the wrong address. However, that's when things got even stranger. The delivery driver said that there was no mistake. He'd been making regular deliveries to this address for nearly the last decade. Both parties were left scratching their heads until the driver mentioned that there was a contact at the Juvenile Correction Center that always handled the deliveries. His name was Gilberto Escamilla. When officials at the facility heard this name, they were still confused, but at least now they had something to go on. Gilberto was a 53-year-old fellow employee of the Juvenile Correction Center and had been working for the Department of Justice for over a decade. It just so happened that on this particular day, he was off work for a medical appointment. In his absence, officials started to dig through old food delivery invoices. What they found quickly transformed their confusion into anger. It turned out that Gilberto had been living a double life. During the day, he was the hard-working and reliable public servant that his co-workers and everyone else thought they knew. But by night, he was running a highly illegal fajita-based side hustle. The scheme worked this way. Gilberto would order fajita meat, seasoning, and other related products with county funds from the correction center's food provider. He would then intercept the delivery once it arrived at the facility and take it away and deliver it later on, usually to a group of regular clients who apparently had no idea that they were buying stolen meat. The man was reportedly even taking pre-orders. That wasn't all, though. Investigators would soon learn that the scheme had been going on for a staggering 9 years. During that time, the 53-year-old had managed to embezzle a whopping $1.2 million worth of funds from the Cameron County Juvenile Justice Department. It was a well-oiled operation. You know, until Gilberto decided to take that poorly timed sick day, and 800 pounds of unexpected fajita meat showed up on the correction center's doorstep. When a search of Gilberto's house was conducted following this realization, authorities found packages and packages of fajitas in his refrigerator. Knowing that he was busted, the 53-year-old confessed. He would later say in court that the crime was driven by selfishness and that the whole thing started out small and just got more and more out of hand. He told the judge, quote, "It got to the point where I couldn't control it anymore." Even though Gilberto pleaded guilty, he was still facing a pretty hefty sentence. Because he had stolen more than $200,000 worth of goods, under Texas law he had committed a first-degree felony and was automatically eligible for a sentence of up to 99 years. The fact that he was a public servant also aggravated the charges. The following year he was sentenced to 50 years in prison for the scheme, a sentence which was upheld upon appeal. According to the most recent available information we could find, Gilberto was eligible for parole as of May of last year, though his official inmate record lists his projected release date as the spring of 2038. This story is particularly good in our opinion because it's sort of a 3 for the price of 1 situation. That is to say, that the knock-on effects from this one mistake arguably went on to screw up 2 other plans, the latter of which would actually become one of the most well-known crime stories in British history. At around 6:45 a.m. on a dull grey morning in February of 2000, a truck pulled out of a compound in the Nine Elms area of southwest London. The vehicle was owned by a business called Securicor, which at that time was one of the largest security companies in the UK. When the truck left Securicor's main depot that morning, it was loaded with 2 tons of cash, amounting to about £10 million, or roughly 16 million in contemporaneous US dollars. It's unclear where exactly the shipment of cash was bound for, but it wouldn't be long before it ran into problems. Unbeknownst to Securicor, at the same time that their cash truck pulled out of the depot, a gang of about a dozen highly prepared criminals were already in the process of heading them off. This would be accomplished with a variety of stolen vehicles, each of which had a dedicated role to play. The gang started by blocking off traffic on both sides of Nine Elms Lane, about a quarter of a mile up the road from where the Securicor truck had departed. Sources contradict each other, but they did this with either 3 or 4 semi-trucks, which were parked at 90-degree angles across the roadway before the criminals immobilized them by cutting some of the lines to their pneumatic systems. As the Securicor truck made its way onto Nine Elms Lane, it was forced to slow along with all the other morning commuter traffic that had been brought to a halt as a result of the blockage. However, just to make sure that they could fully control where the vehicle stopped, the gang of criminals used a high-powered stolen BMW, which pulled in front of the truck and cut it off. A white van pulled up beside the stopped cash truck, after which several more people involved in the scheme jumped out. Some of them ambushed the Securicor employees in the truck, while others, who were equipped with cutting tools, proceeded to dive underneath the truck with the goal of sabotaging the vehicle's tail lift, which covered its rear doors and acted as an extra layer of security protecting the cargo area where the money was held. With all of this complete, it was time for arguably the most dramatic part of the whole plan. The criminals knew that they would need a way to break through the armored cash truck's protective layers, and for this, they had prepared a highly specialized vehicle. It was another large stolen semi-truck, only this one had a huge steel spike welded to the back of its chassis. The idea was to use the modified semi-truck as a huge battering ram, piercing and destroying the Securicor truck's rear doors so that the criminals could access the cash. Once this was accomplished, the gang planned to load the stolen money onto a nearby waiting speedboat on the River Thames, which would ferry them and the cash to safety. However, this is where it all went wrong. You see, though it appeared that the criminals had thought of everything, the one thing they hadn't accounted for was road rage. Like the other large vehicles that were used in the scheme, the battering ram truck had been brought to the scene ahead of time by the gang. Christmas trees had even been put on the back of the vehicle to obscure its steel spike so that it would appear less out of the ordinary. The keys were also left in the ignition, likely out of convenience, so that it could be moved quickly when it needed to be used. However, when the time came for the ramming to occur, the member of the group in charge of operating the truck realized that they had a major problem. When he hopped into the driver's seat, the keys were no longer inside the vehicle. He was stranded. It turned out that when the gang had parked the truck that morning, they had boxed in another car. The owner of that vehicle had since come back, and upon discovering the situation, became furious. As revenge, he had taken the keys out of the truck's ignition. He had no idea that he had just foiled a multi-million-dollar robbery. The gang of criminals, meanwhile, quickly realized that they were screwed. Left with no way to get inside the armored Securicor vehicle, they scattered. Some ran for the speedboat, while others fled in their vehicles or on foot. Any of the vehicles, including the modified battering ram truck that were meant to have been left behind at the scene, were torched with incendiary bombs that had been pre-rigged by the criminals to destroy evidence. Because of this last dramatic step, authorities initially thought the whole thing was a terror attack, though as they started to put together the pieces of what had happened, they realized that it was actually a sophisticated heist. If the criminals had just stopped here, they might have been all right. I mean, sure, they would have walked away with a net loss, considering the time and expense it likely cost them to prepare the operation, but it's unclear if they actually would have been caught. Most of the evidence had been successfully burned up, and there were few leads to go on. But, as I'm sure you can already guess, this is not what happened. Despite the failure of the armored truck robbery, and maybe even perhaps because it was all brought down by such a stupid mistake, the gang decided to try almost the exact same stunt a few months later. On the morning of July 7th, 2000, another Securicor armored cash truck left a depot in the county of Kent. The vehicle was passing through an industrial area in the town of Aylesford, when all of a sudden a Ford Transit van came to a screeching halt in front of it. At the same time, a large Volvo semi-truck pulled itself perpendicular to the road, entirely cutting off the cash truck from behind. Just like in the previous incident, the Securicor employees in the truck were quickly surrounded by the gang of nearly a dozen robbers, who within moments had immobilized their vehicle. Unlike last time, however, the criminals began to attach several large circular devices with flashing lights on them to the truck. They told the Securicor employees that they were bombs. After this, the gang successfully managed to overcome the embarrassing hurdle that had foiled their well-planned operation the first time. They kept an eye on their car keys, and using a second modified truck that had been similarly equipped with a large steel spike, were able to ram the cash truck's rear doors, ostensibly giving them access to the roughly 9 million pounds that was inside. Unfortunately for the criminals, though, they would never actually get their hands on any of this cash. Upon seeing the dramatic situation unfold, witnesses called police, who were quicker to get to the area this time, presumably because the crime took place in a less trafficked area with much less gridlock. The faster police response meant that when officers arrived at the scene, the gang was forced to abort their operation not only empty-handed, but far more hastily. Though they piled into their getaway van and managed to drive it to another waiting speedboat, this time on the River Medway, they didn't have time to torch all of their stolen vehicles like they had during the Nine Elms robbery. This left authorities with a number of new clues. Some of these were more of the amusing variety, like when members of the bomb squad realized that the devices the criminals had put on the Securicor truck to scare the drivers were not explosives, but were in fact steak and kidney pie tins that had been painted and had LED lights slapped on them. However, some of the evidence was extremely useful. In particular, authorities were able to lift fingerprints from the scene, and saliva was found inside of a pair of gloves in the gang's getaway van. If there were any doubts that the Aylesford robbery was connected to the Nine Elms one, police soon found something else that solidified the link in their minds. On one of the girders of the makeshift steel battering ram, the criminals had painted the words "Gertie Mark II," along with the cheeky message, quote, "Persistent, aren't we?" While the investigation was slow going at first, with police only making one arrest in the case, they were able to learn that someone named Terry had been involved in both of the Securicor attempted robberies. About a month later, they would learn that Terry was none other than Terry Millman, a well-known armed robber with a lengthy previous record, who police would later describe as a, quote, old-style criminal. Millman gave authorities something of a gift when he drunkenly lost control of his car that August and crashed into a pub in the borough of Tunbridge Wells. It didn't take long to work out that the vehicle was stolen, but not only that, the forged tax stickers Millman was using on the car looked familiar to police. They bore a striking resemblance to the ones that had been used on all of the stolen vehicles at the Aylesford crime scene. Speaking of stolen vehicles, it was around this time that authorities also had another idea. They had been monitoring two farm properties about 20 miles away from Aylesford, which they suspected were being used as the hub for a number of illegal activities. The owner of these properties was a notorious local family called the Wenhams, who had a long history of run-ins with the law. Authorities had previously felt that they had enough to charge the son of the family, Lee Wenham, with activities related to organized car theft. However, they had so far held off on this, believing there might be something bigger in the works. Knowing that Millman was a contact of Lee Wenham, authorities decided to review video footage that they had taken at the Wenham's family farm properties over the course of their surveillance operation. When they did, they were not only able to learn that Millman had been at these properties around the time of the Aylesford robbery, they were able to obtain footage of two of the vehicles actually used in the crime. This included the spike-equipped truck that had been used to ram the Securicorps cash truck. Upon further investigation, police received even more confirmation when the fingerprints at the Aylesford crime scene were found to be a match to Millman, and the saliva in the getaway van came back as a DNA match to Wenham. Even with all of this information now in hand, authorities still held off on making their move. They wanted to catch as many people involved in the two previous operations as possible, and knowing what they now did, they assumed it would only be a matter of time before the gang tried to strike for a third time. While investigators were correct, they had no idea just how right they were. You see, rather than trying to hit another armored cash truck, the gang was now preparing for something far more ambitious. You might know it as the Millennium Dome Raid. Over the next few months, Millman, Wenham, and a team of co-conspirators that included fellow career criminals Raymond Betson, William Cockram, Aldo Chiarochi, Robert Adams, and Kevin Meredith, planned what at that point would have been the largest value robbery in history. In particular, the gang intended to steal the De Beers Millennium Diamonds, a set of 11 rare blue stones, as well as a 203-carat top-color diamond called the Millennium Star. The collection was valued at anywhere from 200 to 350 million pounds, or about $320 to $560 million USD at the time. Keep in mind, this was in 2000s dollars. One source we came across suggested that the diamonds are worth more than 600 million pounds today. The rare stones were being displayed at the Millennium Dome in Greenwich as part of a diamond exhibition at the time, and the gang knew that they would likely have a window of just a few minutes to carry out their scheme. On top of dealing with security and actually getting into the vault where the valuables were kept, known as the Money Zone, they would need to contend with the diamond's display case. The custom protective case had been made with explosive-resistant glass, was built to resist the force of a 60-ton ram raid, and was designed to keep any known tool at bay for at least 30 minutes. In order to pull off the insane heist, the group of thieves meticulously planned the crime in a similar way that they had the two attempts on the Securicorps armored trucks. In fact, many of the details were extremely similar. They planned to use a variety of stolen vehicles in the crime, including a speedboat which would help them flee the scene on the River Thames once everything was over. Instead of a spike-equipped semi-truck, though, they instead swapped it out for a modified JCB digger, which they would drive through the Millennium Dome's perimeter fence and use to break through the 4-foot concrete walls of the Money Zone. As for the display case, this required a new approach. They would use a high-powered nail gun to warm and weaken the glass, after which they would punch a hole through with a sledgehammer. On the morning of November 7th, 2000, the gang of criminals finally put their plan into action. They broke through the Millennium Dome's perimeter with ease, were in the Money Zone vault in no time, and their solution to the seemingly impenetrable display case worked amazingly. They smashed through in just 27 seconds. However, just like in the two previous Securicorps robberies, just when everything seemed to be in reach for the criminals, it all went wrong. At least, from their perspective anyway. In actuality, investigators had known that the Millennium Dome raid was coming for months before it had happened. Not only that, it was largely thanks to the two Securicorps screw-ups. You see, after police discovered Millman and Wenham's roles in the failed armored cash truck robberies, they continued to keep them under watch. While they initially suspected that the men would plan a third truck robbery, through the course of their surveillance they discovered that they were making suspicious trips to the Millennium Diamond exhibition. At some point, one of the detectives working the case realized what was happening. They were casing the place for a robbery. It wasn't long after that investigators started to spot other familiar faces during their surveillance operation. Other career criminals who were clearly working with Millman and Wenham, such as Raymond Betson and William Cockram. Now confident that they knew what the men were going to do, authorities organized a massive effort of their own in preparation for the attempted diamond heist. This plan, entitled Operation Magician, was led by a branch of the London Metropolitan Police Service's Serious and Organised Crime Command, nicknamed the Flying Squad. The operation enlisted the help of countless police officers, at least 200 of whom were present at the Millennium Dome on the actual morning of the raid. Many of them were disguised to look like tourists, random pedestrians, and Dome employees, to the point that when the gang actually carried out the heist, there were reportedly more police officers than genuine visitors present at the scene. Within minutes, these officers had swooped in, surrounding some of the thieves as they broke into the heavy-duty display case, while simultaneously pouncing on those stationed in the gang's lookout and escape vehicles. All of them were placed under arrest at the scene. If you're wondering why investigators actually let the gang of men pull off one of the most ambitious attempted robberies in history, if they pretty much knew what they were going to do beforehand, then you're not alone. We were pretty confused about that as well. The best answer to this we were able to come across comes from a couple of sources at the time that we were able to find, which claimed that Scotland Yard were apparently adamant that the men had to be caught red-handed. The stated reason for this was that they were convinced that if they didn't do this, they risked the gang moving on to another target. We're not really sure what to make of this, but we suppose it sort of makes sense, considering the gang had pretty much proven at this point that they were going to just keep trying to pull off these massive robberies until they were finally caught. That being said, apparently great security measures were taken in preparation for the Millennium Dome heist. By the time the men were crashing through the property's exterior fence and heading towards the money vault, police were already reportedly in the process of clearing the area and ushering any genuine civilians away. The Millennium Diamonds themselves had also long since been removed from the facility. As soon as police realized what the men were planning, they had informed the gems' owners and had swapped them out with worthless fakes long before November 7th. So yeah, the best the gang could have hoped for that day was to walk away empty-handed for a third time in a row. In the aftermath of the sensational crime, pretty much everyone involved received lengthy prison sentences. The exception was Terry Millman, who died of cancer before the trial a year later. Kevin Meredith also arguably received a light sentence, as he was only convicted of conspiring to steal and was given 5 years. Lee Wenham was sentenced to 4 years for conspiracy to steal, plus a further 9 years for the botched Aylesford robbery. As far as we can tell, he was actually the only person nailed for either of the Securicor incidents. Aldo Chiarocci and Robert Adams received 15 years apiece, while Raymond Betson and William Cochran, who are considered to be the masterminds behind the scheme, were each sentenced to 18 years. While it's clear that the men made a number of mistakes throughout the course of planning and executing these crimes, we would argue that you can, in fact, trace one clear line from the Millennium Dome raid back to that set of poorly watched car keys. If they had been able to get away with the crime the first time, maybe the men wouldn't have tried a second time, essentially handing the police the evidence they would need to identify and ultimately bring them down for the diamond heist. If nothing else, it's a pretty crazy thing to think about. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a second to give a huge shout out to everyone who has made it this far into the video. Seriously, thank you so much for watching. If you found today's upload interesting and informative, we'd be honored if you'd consider liking and subscribing, as well as hitting the notification bell and selecting all notifications to stay up to date with our latest releases. If you're looking for additional ways to help support the channel, we'd love to have you join us over on Patreon. Patrons get ad-free and early access to all of our content, as well as 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. You can learn more at patreon.com/crimezone, where you'll also find some of the fine folks whose names are currently on screen. All that being said, we understand that not everyone has the means to support financially, and that's totally okay. We appreciate every like, sub, share, and comment that you send our way. Once again, thanks so much everyone, and take care.